show! This is the show where I read an article a day to keep my stupid away. You learn something, I learn something. We learn together. Today's article is all about magic mushrooms. Ooh, getting magical. Psychedelic even. This article was actually sent over by a friend of mine. And it is entitled, Get Ready for Pharmaceutical Grade Magic Mushroom Pills. As magic mushrooms make the shift from recreational drug to mental health treatment, patients won't be eating caps and stems, but a synthetic product made in the lab, one that can be patented and profited from. Much like what is happening with the marijuana industry currently. Now, this article was interesting to me because I have actually microdosed mushrooms before. I think I've mentioned it on the show. And for that month, it really helped me open up and become, I think, a warmer person. So I was interested to see what this had to say about magic mushrooms. In 1955, a bank executive and New York Society photographer found themselves in a thatch-roofed adobe home in a remote village in the Mazteca Mountains. Gordon Wasson, then the vice president of J.P. Morgan, had been learning about the use of mushrooms in different cultures and tracked down a Maztec healer, curandera, named Maria Sabina. Sabina was about 60 at the time and had been taking hallucinogenic mushrooms since she was a young child. She led Watson and the photographer Alan Richardson through a mushroom ceremony called the Vidala. We chewed and swallowed these acrid mushrooms, saw visions, and emerged from the experience awestruck, Watson wrote in a Life magazine article, seeking the magic mushroom. We had come from afar to attend a mushroom rite, but had expected nothing so staggering as the virtuosity of the performing curanderas and the astonishing effects of the mushrooms. Appointing himself as one of the, quote, first white men in recorded history to eat the divine mushrooms, Wasson inadvertently exposed much of the Western world and the burgeoning counterculture movement to psychedelic mushrooms. On the other side of the globe, the Swiss drug company Sandoz received 100 grams of the mushrooms from a botanist who had visited Sabina on one of Wasson's return trips. They went to the lab of Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who first synthesized LSD, and in 1963, Hofmann traveled to Mexico with pills containing synthetic psilocybin, the active compound found in magic mushrooms. We explained to Maria Sabina that we had isolated the spirit of the mushrooms and it was now in these little pills, Hofmann said during an interview in 1984. When we left, Maria Sabina told us that these tablets really contain the spirit of the mushrooms. They captured the spirit of the mushrooms in a pill! Hoffman's pills were the first indication that white people can have spiritual and transcendent experiences from eating the mushrooms themselves. They can also have such experiences with a man-made version of just one of the mushroom's compounds, psilocybin. This development is particularly relevant today as scientists study psychedelic mushrooms as a potential treatment option for those who suffer from severe depression, addiction, and more. In clinical trials such as those ongoing at the Johns Hopkins University and the Imperial College of London, participants don't eat caps or stems. They instead consume synthetic psilocybin made in labs by chemists in a similar way to how Hofmann first made his psilocybin. As psilocybin moves closer to becoming a legal medicine meeting all the regulatory requirements, doctors won't be writing prescriptions for mushroom caps or stems, and this will come at a certain cost. Johns Hopkins researchers have claimed that they've paid labs $7,000 to $10,000 per gram of psilocybin, whereas the street price of magical mushrooms is around $10 per gram. Besides the cost of chemical materials, the steep sticker price comes from the labor required to adhere to the USDA strict drug-making standards known as the Current Good Manufacturing Practice. It's an unprecedented moment, and psychedelic culture must reckon with what it means for magic mushrooms to become a synthetic pill, to be picked up at the pharmacy or from a doctor. There's some wariness in the psychedelic community about what the synthetic psilocybin represents. Big business, questionable investors, and patents on experiences they think shouldn't have a price tag or a profit margin. Since it's a known natural compound, psilocybin itself cannot be patented, but the way it's made and the way it's used can be. Already there are organizations applying for patents for their synthesis process, and innovators coming up with new ways to make large amounts of synthetic psilocybin, all seeking protection for their intellectual property. Now, quick note here, as someone who's actually written and applied for patents before, I will say that patents don't protect you as much as people think that they do. They protect a process and a method, but people are very crafty in coming up with ways to do things that are new and thus kind of getting around your patent. Plus, if you're not actively using your patent to protect your invention, then the patent's useless anyways. So you have to take a very active role even if you're granted a patent in seeking out other people infringing on your patent and then suing them. So it's actually not as much protection as you would think. There are two big name players already making synthetic psilocybin with the goal of eventually treating people with depression or other mental health issues. One is a for-profit company, Compass Pathways. Another is a nonprofit, Usona Institute. Compass is a London-based company that received breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA for its synthetic psilocybin therapy for treatment-resistant depression, meaning that its preliminary clinical evidence was so promising, the FDA will fast-track its review process to potentially make psilocybin a legal therapy for depression. Incredible. The Usona Institute, on the other hand, has emerged with different strategy. It was founded after Bill Linton, the CEO of Life Sciences Company, had a friend participate in a psilocybin trial at Johns Hopkins that helped cancer patients with end-of-life anxiety. Usona is a non-profit organization funded by investors and donors, and it has decided not to apply for any patents, even though Usona has its own process for making psilocybin too. Well, on one side, we have a patented version from a for-profit company, and on the other side, a non-profit that decided not to patent their technology. This is a very interesting juxtaposition. And so the psychedelic community will have to contend with this. Some people might get rich. People that were in psychedelic communities in the early days had this assumption and feeling that psilocybin was something that was going to be made available as a gift to the world, to humanity as a whole, and not something that would be made available within the structure of big business, Raisin said. Many have negative views on how pharmaceutical companies develop drugs and the high prices they put on the latter. They don't want to see that happen to psychedelics. We naturally want to encourage the proper containers and intentions surrounding these powerful substances and practices. As such, we tend to be wary of for-profit endeavors as they can potentially involve ethical compromises for those whose primary goal is profit. Who's right on this side and who's wrong on this side, we don't know. Only history will tell, but perhaps there's some lessons to be learned from what happened after Gordon Wasson wrote about Maria Sabina in Life magazine more than 60 years ago. Celebrities and tourists flocked to Sabina's town to partake in drug ceremonies and ended up disrespecting the local culture and traditions. Sabina was blamed for this and shunned by her own people. Her house was burnt down and she was investigated by the government as a possible drug dealer. She eventually said, according to her biography, that after the foreigners arrived, the mushrooms had lost their force, they ruined them, henceforth they will no longer work. There's no remedy for it. AKA, she was regretful that this whole thing happened and she tried to cover it up and push people away by saying that the mushrooms would no longer work. That's what I hear, and that's a really unfortunate thing. Medicinal psychedelics are coming, and the future will need to make space for both recreational and pharmaceutical uses. Hopefully one doesn't have to destroy the other, and the people with different associations with these drugs can find room for those beliefs. And that's it. I think that this mushroom question is a little bit different than the weed legalization question. So weed hasn't really been linked to such a spiritual experience as psychedelics have been. They've been kind of separate. Weed gets you high, and psychedelics were supposed to open your mind. So I understand the difference here between those two pathways. And it's very sad to hear the story of Sabina's village, where people flooded the area as tourists and then became disrespectful to the rights and traditions there and trashed the village. I think that is a very sad story. But I don't think it applies quite as much here, mainly because back then in the 1950s, 1970s, 1980s even, we didn't have such commercialization and ease of use of making these products. So because it was such a new thing and it was kind of underground, they had to go to that village and they had to travel out and seek it out in these small off the beaten path and cultural places. And thus tourists flock those locations because they could only get it there. So now if we make it legal and we can get it at our doctors or we can get it even at the pharmacy, it stops people from flooding these tourist destinations and ruining the local rights and customs, and instead empowers them to get it closer to home so they don't have to go there. But it does not remove the fact that those places still exist. Then they don't have to get dirtied up by tourists who are disrespectful. And now the people who can truly appreciate those spiritual experiences can travel to those locations and have those experiences with those shamans in a safe place and pay a fair amount and actually connect with those people and the culture there. And everyone else who's just a psychedelic boy can have their mushrooms at home. So what do you think about it? Let me know in the comments. Are you going to try out some pharmaceutical psychedelics when they happen? Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, this has been today's Joe Show. If you find an interesting article like my friend did, send it over to hijoeshow@gmail.com. Otherwise, you can send love, hate, and whatever over there. Follow me on @ajoeshow@gmail. Follow me on @ajoeshow on Instagram. Otherwise, until next time, read something good. I love you.